My name is Alex Dworjan. I'm an Ansible specialist, and I'm going to be walking through the event-driven Ansible ServiceNow plugin. So what is the event-driven Ansible ServiceNow plugin? It's a event source plugin that's part of the servicenow.itsm collection, and I largely look at it as a replacement for the event-driven Ansible notification service. That's an application that you can install in ServiceNow. So rather than ServiceNow reaching outbound to the automation platform, it polls ServiceNow. So you can pick any table that you want, any query that you want, such as catalog requests, incidents, change requests. Really, the realm of possibilities is endless based on what table you pick and what query you put into the plugin itself. So what do I actually need to configure? So I don't really need much configuration on the ServiceNow side other than an actual user that can connect. So it needs to have the necessary permissions to be able to read from the appropriate table. I then need to make sure I have a decision environment that has the servicenow.itsm collection installed. And then I'll need some sort of rulebook created that can actually take action based on the information that I gather. So what might a rulebook look like? So this is a pretty basic rulebook. In this case, I'm pulling the SC request table. So the ServiceNow catalog request table, and I'm pulling it every 5 seconds. In this case, I'm specifically, again, looking to see that an SC request table information is received. And then I want to run an enrichment job, which will gather extra information. The reason for that is if you've ever looked at ServiceNow and done a basic catalog request, much of the information lives outside of that SC request table. So it lives in the RITM. There are variables that are all separate. So there is some additional enrichment that's required. That's why I don't look at it as a straight replacement for Ansible Spoke, because sometimes, depending on what catalog or what table that you're trying to pull from, there's additional information that you need to gather as part of that process. So let's dive into an example and let's see how this works in practice. So I've already created a rulebook inside my environment to leverage and connect to the specific table that I want. I do specifically have execution strategy set to parallel. So as more requests come in, I don't wait for one to finish before I take action. So this allows me to take every single request that comes in and immediately take action on it by running a job template workflow. I then have my rules. In this case, this is that enrichment job. So if it's coming from the request table and it's that first request, aka it's just been created, then run through my enrichment job, which I'll show in a second. This is a key piece where I post events and I have this set to true. So essentially, when that job finishes, it posts all the events back into this rule book, and then I can use additional rules to take actions. So any sort of table that requires additional enrichment, I would recommend having this at the front, do whatever enrichment I need to connect to multiple tables, pass in information back into the rulebook, and then add in the extra conditions based on what comes back. So in this case, I'm looking for event.enriched data, which again, I'll show in a second. And I'm looking for a specific catalog item. And then I'm launching a workflow based on that, based on all the extra vars that come back. So what am I doing in that enrichment job? So I'm actually retrieving the RITM based on the REQ that comes in. So that SC request table, I'm using that to get the extra information from that ID. I'm gathering some extra facts, including the user details, as well as the variables themselves. And then all of that gets passed back into the rulebook itself by combining everything together. And then I do a set fact and a set stat at the end to pass all that information back into the rulebook. So rather than having this call multiple job templates, I have everything passed back into the rulebook itself. So as I build out additional catalog items, I can just copy and paste this portion of the rulebook and build out. So this is helpful for any table that doesn't necessarily have all your information. Use essentially a enrichment job to gather that information. So inside the automation platform itself, I've created a custom credential type, just like I've done for automation controller in the past, to give me capability to actually connect to ServiceNow. So because this is using the servicenow.itsm collection, all the previous connection methods are there, but I'm using, in this case, environment variables for the host, password, and username. And I have a rulebook up and running. As you saw, I had variables for the table and interval. So I'm passing them in as variables to my rulebook activation itself. So let's actually run a job that's going to leverage this. So I'm going into ServiceNow, and I've got a catalog item that conveniently doesn't have Ansible Spoke or anything like that connected. So in this case, I'll pick a couple random bits of information, pick the operating system, pick the hypervisor, and then click Order Now. So obviously this will kick off the rulebook, which will then also kick off that helper job. So if I go into the automation platform itself and I go to jobs, I should see that that enrichment job is running. So this enrichment job will run, gather the extra information about the details related to the actual environment. So I can see in here, since I did that debug output, I can see the operating system, the hypervisor, the virtual machine name, the environment. And now that will provide back to the rulebook itself, which will then launch the larger job, which is actually running the workflow. So I can see in the workflow itself, I do actually pass in that virtual machine name, the owner, because that was one of the extra information that I gathered as part of the ticket enrichment, the environment, the ticket number, the operating system, and the hypervisor. So all of this was part of that wrapper job that essentially did that ticket enrichment. So as you dive into ServiceNow and find out that maybe not necessarily everything is part of the initial table that does the creation, you can easily gather extra information, populate that back into the rulebook, and go from there. So this, for me, will do a full provisioning process without anything else set up inside ServiceNow. So I didn't have to download an application. I didn't have to set up Ansible Spoke. I didn't have to create anything within Flow Designer. All of this is managed with a single user that I created in ServiceNow that has read access to the SC request table. Obviously, I also have access to pull from the RITM and the RITM variables. And then I'm just leveraging the capability of Ansible to do the rest. So it's a much quicker way to get started if I don't necessarily have access to ServiceNow or Flow Designer itself. So I will include in the description down below the actual documentation for the servicenow.itsm collection, specifically with that event-driven Ansible plugin. But as you can see, it's got these same parameters for actually setting up the instance. So whether you're using access token, API key, the same environment variables that you're used to when trying to leverage the Ansible creating tables or making updates to ServiceNow, the same thing applies with this plugin. And then obviously I've got the setting up the interval and any sort of queries that you want to make to the individual table itself. I did want to show as well, this is what the actual message is from ServiceNow. So using that ServiceNow records, specifically for SC table, if you notice, there's not a ton of information here. I don't see the variables or anything like that. So that's specifically why I had to go through that process of gathering additional information, because it's just not part of what ServiceNow stores in the SC request table. So take a look at what the outbound messages are from your various tables, and that's what will determine if you need some additional information gathering. I will also paste in the description down below my blog that walks through the entire process of setting this up. So if you have any questions about setting up the custom credential type or the rulebook, all of that will be included in the description down below, as well as a link to the role that I created to do that enrichment to gather the variables and the user information that I then pass back to the rulebook. I also include that rulebook in the description down below, so you've got that as a good starting point. Obviously, modify that for whatever table that you want to monitor, whether it's the incident table, problem table, or anything that the ServiceNow user has access to. So if you do run into any issues with, hey, I can't pull that table for whatever reason, the first thing I would check is whatever user that you've got set up that you've put into the credential inside Ansible, verify that that user actually has access to the table that you're trying to pull. And then once again, I'll include the plugin documentation in the description down below as well, so you can get started trying to figure out how to align with your particular credential type to connect to ServiceNow, as well as setting up the table and queries. Thank you for taking the time to learn a little bit more about the ServiceNow event-driven Ansible plugin. Hopefully this gives you another way to connect ServiceNow as your ITSM and Ansible, and look into ways to replace the event-driven Ansible notification service.
Click my picture on the right to subscribe, or click the image on the left to watch another video.